Okay, guys, this is the last day of the Gilded Era. Tomorrow I'll post a Kahoot for review, and then on Friday you will have your test over this information. Make sure you turn in your notes after you take the test. Okay, we're going to talk about the Galveston hurricane. This is the largest natural disaster that the United States has ever has ever experienced. It was in August of 1900. Over 6 people will die. There was no early warning system here, and it was a tragedy. Again, this is shown.
4 years ago this week, the worst natural disaster ever to strike this country hit the Texas coast. 6,000 people were killed on Galveston Island in the Great Storm of 1900. Our Charles Hadlock reports tonight some of those who died are now being remembered.
Galveston has never turned its back on the Gulf, but it has put up a wall. For most of this century, the wall has protected the city from powerful hurricanes, but it cannot protect it from the painful memory of what happened here during the Great Storm of 1900. St. Mary's Orphanage was built away from town to isolate the children from the yellow fever and other deadly diseases that had claimed their parents. 10 Catholic nuns ran the orphanage. In the summer of 1900, 93 children lived there. The orphanage was built just a few feet from the sandy beach. On September 8, 1900, the sisters looked out from the orphanage and knew something was wrong.
They could see it coming in, and that they knew the wind was getting higher and higher.
Julia Wilson's father, Frank Madera, was one of the boys in the orphanage. He and the other children were told to prepare for a storm. Earlier that day, Sister Elizabeth Ryan had gone to town to gather provisions. She stopped by St. Mary's Infirmary to visit the sick.
The sisters here at the hospital tried to encourage Sister Elizabeth Ryan to stay. And they said, just wait till after the storm passes. And she said, no. She said, I have to get back to the orphanage. She said, because I have the provisions in the wagon. And if I don't get back, the orphans will have no supper tonight. She didn't know that whether she made it back or not, there would be no more suppers at the orphanage.
The sisters at the orphanage moved the children from the boys' dormitory to the new, stronger girls' building next door.
And they sang an old French hymn called Queen of the Waves. And they sang that song trying to keep the children calm.
Queen of the waves.
With the surf rising, everyone moved to the second floor, including 13-year-old William Murney. Murney had lived in the orphanage only a short time. His mother had just died of tuberculosis, and his father died the very next day of a heart attack. Now, his own life was in peril.
He recounted a long evening of fear, the winds howling, raging, and the water rising. The water came in to the lower floor.
And each sister took a section of rope and tied one end to a child and the other end to the cincture that they wore around their waist. And each sister tied to herself between 6 and 8 orphans.
Suddenly, a giant wall of water crashed into the empty boys' dormitory next door.
And that increased the fears of the children, and they started to scream. And the sisters tried to calm them down and had them again sing Queen of the Waves.
Some of the orphans looked up in time to see a ship smash into the last remaining building at the orphanage.
The orphanage was lifted from its foundation. It floated for a few minutes, and then the roof caved in, trapping the sisters and the children in the water.
The whole building seemed to collapse at once.
William Murney grabbed his younger brother.
He was holding his brother, his 8-year-old brother. And he thinks a beam hit him, and he never saw his brother again. And he had recollections of being in the cold water, but those were very vague. And he says the real thing that he remembers most was waking up in a tree.
3 boys survived the storm by clinging to a tree. Everyone else died in a watery grave.
One of the scenes he did recall is after he was awakened and was in the tree, seeing some of the bodies of the nuns floating by with 2 or 3 orphans tied to them.
Eventually, the boys were rescued.
Men, he said, were either sailors or people from Galveston that had a small boat that came by and picked them up.
By daylight, the boys could clearly see how truly lucky they were. 6,000 people had died during the night. Many bodies, including those of the nuns and children, were buried where they were found. Others were loaded onto barges and carried out into the Gulf. The young survivors grew up quickly. William Murney lived at St. Mary's Infirmary after the storm and helped the nuns there care for the injured. He later lied about his age and got a job with the railroad. Murney stayed in touch through letters to the other 2 boys with whom he spent that terrifying night together clinging to a tree. But over time, they drifted apart. Now, 94 years later, the state of Texas is honoring the nuns and children lost in the orphanage. The descendants of the 3 survivors will attend the dedication of a marker placed near the site of the orphanage. The marker sits on the wall that protects the city, but it cannot protect it from a painful memory. Charles Hadlock, 11 News, Galveston.
And that marker will be dedicated Thursday night. Dan has the Back to Work forecast next.
Laid out. This led to the end of the political machines. They couldn't handle these problems efficiently, rebuilding Galveston. And so what are they going to do? They are going to form committees, put people with expertise in charge, city managers, and this is going to evolve into a city council, city manager system, and that's going to spread throughout the United States. Okay, social gospel. This is vocabulary for you. Okay, social gospel movement is anything that involves God. So a prime example of social gospel is the Salvation Army. You know, those folks out there with the bells, church shelters, soup kitchens. They get their money from Americans, and back in the day, you know, throwing money in the pots and old wealth. Another social gospel organization, YWCA, YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association. So any organization with God. We're going to look at 3 new presidents leading up to the imperialistic and through the imperialistic region. Theodore Roosevelt, 26, William Howard Taft, 27, and another Democrat now, Woodrow Wilson. These are the Progressive Era presidents. So our last president of the Gilded Age is McKinley, and Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson are our progressive presidents. So let's talk about Theodore. These are some facts. You can pause this, look it over. His daddy was the founder of the Museum of Natural History. If you've seen Night in the Museum, he loved nature, created 5 national parks. That's his legacy, the conservation president. He's one of the 4 who is on Mount Rushmore. And as a child, he had asthma, and his daddy believed in working it out. So he strenuous exercise regime, and he became a boxer and a cowboy and a hunter. Sadly, a tragic life. His wife and mother died on the same day. He moves out west, becomes a cowboy. And when he came back, he married his childhood sweetheart and had 5 more children. So 6 children, and he is going to form the Bull Moose Party of Progressive.
On the national political landscape, the times seemed ripe for a progressive United States president. And one emerged, if only by a twist of fate. Six months after being elected president for the second time, William McKinley was assassinated, and his running mate, 42-year-old Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, succeeded him in 1901. He was the youngest person ever to hold that office. Roosevelt was born into a wealthy family. And although he suffered from asthma, he was determined to live an active life. From marksmanship to horseback riding and tennis, to boxing and hunting, to his heroic exploits with the Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt proved a popular leader, first as governor of New York and then as president. When asked why people so adored him, he said he thought it was because
I put into words what is in their hearts and minds, but not their mouths.
Roosevelt outlined many progressive reforms to the American public and gave his plan a name, the Square Deal. When Roosevelt assumed office, over 80% of American business was owned by trusts. Although Congress had already enacted the Sherman Antitrust Act, it had not stopped the trusts from using unfair business practices to destroy their competition. Roosevelt began by suing the Northern Securities Railroad Trust. And in 1904, the Supreme Court agreed that the trust had become a monopoly and ordered it dissolved. Roosevelt's administration filed over 40 more suits. They pursued the beef industry, Standard Oil, the American Tobacco Company, and many other trusts. Americans overwhelmingly returned Roosevelt to the presidency in 1904, as he continued his work as a trust buster and a staunch proponent of governmental regulation of business. The many other progressives who were serving in local, state, and federal government helped Roosevelt to get the support he needed to get his proposed laws passed, like Mayor Samuel Golden Rule Jones of Toledo, Ohio, Governors Charles Aycock of North Carolina, Albert Cummins of Iowa, and Fighting Bob La Follette of Wisconsin, both of whom became United States senators. 2 years after his reelection, Roosevelt saw the Hepburn Act become law, which gave the Federal Interstate Commerce Commission the power to regulate the maximum fees railroads could charge. Roosevelt next turned his attention to questions surrounding public health. Like most Americans, he was horrified when he read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and even considered becoming a vegetarian. He appointed a commission to investigate Sinclair's claims.
A man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go in the hoppers together.
Sinclair's charges of unsanitary conditions proved to be true. The commission confirmed his description of potted ham as a hash containing ground rope and pigskin. So in 1906, with Roosevelt's urging, Congress adopted the Meat Inspection Act. Federal inspectors would now guarantee safe, sanitary meat. That same year, more reforms followed, with the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act. Manufacturers now had to list the contents of foods and drugs on labels and could not make exaggerated claims about a medicine's benefits. No deleterious drug, chemical, or preservative could be used in medicines or foods. Roosevelt brought the same enthusiasm to protecting America's natural resources that he did to leveling the business playing field. After graduating from Harvard University, a young Theodore Roosevelt had worked as a cattle rancher in the Dakotas. He quickly realized that ranchers were allowing cattle to overgraze the Great Plains, that farmers had cut down forests and plowed under the prairies, and that America's natural resources were being squandered.
What will happen when our forests are gone, when the coal, the iron, the oil, and the gas are exhausted?
As president, Roosevelt withdrew 148 million acres of forest land from public sale, an area larger than Germany. On the advice of his friend, naturalist John Muir, Roosevelt established over 50 wildlife sanctuaries, 5 national parks, and designated 18 national monuments. He also put fellow conservationist Gifford Pinchot in charge of supervising the national forests.
The nation was obsessed by a fury of development. The American Colossus was fiercely intent on appropriating and exploiting the riches of the richest of all continents.
Roosevelt was so determined that Americans realized that the country's resources were not endless that he even banned Christmas trees in the White House. Theodore Roosevelt ignored tradition and redefined the image and scope of the President of the United States. He chose to be vibrant, visible and accessible. Roosevelt was the people's choice throughout America, and in turn, America allowed him to use what he called his bully pulpit to accomplish his goals of reform and governmental regulation. However, a third term as president wasn't in keeping with tradition. So, bowing to President, Roosevelt instead handpicked his successor.
He was at 42, the youngest president ever to serve. He won't be the youngest elected, that's John F. Kennedy, but at 42, the youngest to actually take office. The first modern president, the first 20th century president. So his first term as president, as you saw, he accomplished quite a bit. He takes out office after McKinley is assassinated, and he uses what is called the bully pulpit to get his message across. He said, if you think of a preacher in a pulpit, he's giving a message to his flock, and he is going to use that pulpit. He is a master. So he is going to, his domestic policy is going to be called the square deal. And basically a square deal is a fair deal for people. He's going to break a large trust called the Northern Security Trust. It was a railroad monopoly. And he's going to go after a few others. But Teddy believed that there were some good trusts. So he kind of did some picking and choosing when he was looking at. He also arbitrated a coal strike in 1902. He threatened to send in troops if the owners would not talk to the union leaders, and they caved. He negotiated peace in the Russo-Japanese War and ends up winning a Nobel Peace Prize. He will be our first president to win a Nobel Peace Prize. His second term, he is going to pass the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. And his conservation policy is going to result in national parks, forest preserves, and that's what he was like to be remembered as, our conservation president. He is the first president to really take action to conserve the environment. Now, he isn't the first to do a national park. That was Yellowstone under Grant, but he is going to do the most to preserve our beautiful forest and parks throughout the country. As a progressive, you see the picture here with him with Booker T. Washington. This one's really good. It's got Lincoln here in the background looking on with approval. The South went nuts. They did not appreciate the fact that he had Booker T. for dinner. So he handpicks William Taft. William Taft is the real trustmaster. He didn't differentiate between good and bad trust. He went after any monopoly. His nickname was Big Love. He is our biggest president. He's our only president to later serve on the Supreme Court as a Chief Justice. He was over 300 pounds. And his wife Nellie, when he was in the Philippines, he visited Japan. They loved them there, and Japan sent Japanese cherry trees to Washington, D.C. And Nellie had them planted all around Washington, D.C. And now every spring, these cherry blossoms, they have cherry blossoms festivals, and it's absolutely beautiful. He did not really like being president. His wife dies the first year of his presidency, and he proceeds to put on lots and lots of weight. And yes, he did get stuck in the tub. So Roosevelt is a tough act to follow. The election of 1908 is pretty easy. He's hand-selected.
William Howard Taft, who easily won the presidency in 1908. Taft shared Roosevelt's progressive beliefs, if not his overwhelming popularity. His much more conservative approach to reform disappointed not only the more progressive members of his own party, but the public at large. The fact that the third-party candidate, socialist Eugene Debs, received almost 500,000 votes for president was a clear indication that a great many Americans wanted more radical change than even Roosevelt had pioneered. Now, under Taft's leadership, they felt cheated. Although he was physically large, 6 feet tall and 350 pounds, Taft was no match for the size of Roosevelt's personality and popularity with voters. Taft was a distinguished lawyer and judge, but timid and uncomfortable as a politician. When he lost re-election to Woodrow Wilson in 1912, he returned to his real love, the law, and became the only ex-president to have been chosen as a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He said the White House was the loneliest place in the world.
I don't remember that I ever was president.
Taft's one term as president was not without success, but the bitter political wrangling within his own party distracted the public's attention. Taft actually broke up more than twice the number of trusts as Roosevelt during his presidency. He convinced Congress to pass the Mann-Elkins Act, giving the Interstate Commerce Commission the ability to regulate telephone and telegraph companies. And he urged Congress to pass the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, a federal income tax. It was ratified by the states a year after he left office. Still, Taft was more sympathetic to the demands of the conservatives in the Republican Party than the progressives, and the public believed he was failing to continue Roosevelt's reforms. They were outraged when Taft signed the Payne-Aldrich Tariff, raising prices on imported goods, and incensed when Taft fired Gifford Pinchot. When Theodore Roosevelt returned to America from overseas in 1910, he was given a hero's welcome. The public urged him to seek a third term as president, and 2 years later he did. However, the Republican Party refused to seat Roosevelt's delegates to their convention, and as a result, Taft was renominated as a presidential candidate on the first ballot. Furious, Roosevelt and his supporters formed their own political party, aptly named the Progressive Party. After, Roosevelt boasted,
"I'm as strong as a bull moose and ready for the fight."
The Progressive Party then became known as the Bull Moose Party. Former friends and party members, now political enemies, Taft and Roosevelt battled each other for votes. Taft called Roosevelt a dangerous egotist, while Roosevelt said Taft was
a fathead with the brain of a guinea pig.
Meanwhile, the Democratic reform governor, now presidential candidate Woodrow Wilson, championed his own progressive program called the New Freedom to American voters, and wisely steered clear of the bickering between Roosevelt and Taft.
Don't interfere when your enemy is destroying itself.
With the Republican Party votes split between Taft and Roosevelt, Wilson won a majority of the Electoral College votes and became president.
Presidency of Taft, he is going to be the trust buster. He's the guy who got Standard Oil. He's going to fire Pinchot, who was Roosevelt's man. Pinchot had been very derisive and said kind of nasty things about him, and that is going to anger Theodore Roosevelt when he comes back. So Roosevelt comes back and he sees that Taft isn't doing exactly what he wants him to do, and so he is a little bit angry about that. So he actually asks Taft not to run, and Taft kind of gets his back up and says, "Wait a minute, I'm president now. I am going to run." And they decide to run against each other. The Democrats are going to draft a candidate named
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 32nd presidential election in American history took place on November 5th, 1912. Oh yeah, this was the election that was completely and utterly messed up. It was weird, man. Really weird. How weird? Well, look at that electoral map, for crying out loud. What the heck is that? But I'm ahead of myself. Let's go back a bit. The Taft presidency was supposed to be Theodore Roosevelt 2.0, but right off the bat, it just wasn't that way. Taft was like his own person. He fired cabinet members that Roosevelt had approved of or appointed. While Taft continued to fight trusts, he placed less of a commitment to conservation, labor unions, and restrictions on the employment of women and children. Soon there was a clear split in the Republican Party between the more conservative-leaning Republicans led by Taft and the progressive Republicans led by Teddy Roosevelt. After traveling around the world with his family for more than a year, Roosevelt came home to one of the biggest receptions ever ever given in New York City. Initially neutral about giving his opinion about how his friend was doing as president, that changed when eventually a bunch of progressive Republicans had convinced Roosevelt to run against Taft in 1912. The Republicans expanded their primaries to include even more delegates from across the country to the National Convention to choose their nominee. Going into the convention, Roosevelt actually had more delegates than Taft did. Taft's people, however, controlled the convention and essentially shut out many of the Roosevelt delegates. This, of course, made Roosevelt very angry, and he and his supporters stormed out of the convention. Not since the election of 1872 had there been such a major divide within the Republican Party. In fact, Roosevelt and his supporters completely abandoned the Republicans, 2 weeks later meeting up to create their own political party called the Progressive Party. These progressives nominated Roosevelt for president, well, duh, and Hiram Johnson, the governor of California, as his running mate. At the convention, Roosevelt passionately promoted what he called a new nationalism. Their platform sought a minimum wage for women, an 8-hour workday, a child labor law, a social security system, a national health service, and the direct election of U.S. senators, among other things. Afterward, Roosevelt told reporters he felt as strong as a bull moose. After that, the Progressive Party became popularly known as the Bull Moose Party. Despite the excitement of the Bull Moose Party, the Republicans pressed on with Taft as their candidate and James Sherman again as his running mate. Believe it or not, Sherman was the first incumbent vice president to be nominated for re-election since John Calhoun way back in 1828. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party, who hadn't done so well in presidential elections since, I don't know, before the Civil War, saw this major split of the Republican Party as a golden opportunity. They had a bit of drama as well at their own convention. Originally, it looked like Champ Clark, the Speaker of the House from Missouri, was going to be the guy, but he failed to get the 2/3 majority needed to secure the nomination. In second place was Woodrow Wilson, the governor of New Jersey. Wilson didn't really think he had a chance, but then William Jennings Bryan decided to endorse him, and Bryan still had a lot of fans, so he had a lot of influence. On the 46th ballot, that's right, I said 46th, Wilson was nominated, with Thomas Marshall, the governor of Indiana, as his running mate. So that's it? Oh, heck no. In 1912, Eugene Debs ran for president a 4th time, trying to keep together a socialist party that was also splintering. Debs was by this time a recognizable name across the nation, and his running mate was Emil Seidel, the former mayor of Milwaukee, the first ever socialist mayor of an American city, as a matter of fact. The Prohibition Party responded to Eugene running again by having their Eugene run again. Eugene Chafin gave it a second try with Aaron Watkins again as his running mate. The campaigns were dominated by the rivalry between Taft and Roosevelt, former friends who now seem like bitter enemies. With those two fighting, the election looked to be a lock for Wilson, which was lucky for the Democrats because Wilson wasn't the most charismatic person. Teddy Roosevelt was, but critics said he was running more for his ego and for spoiling the election for the Republicans than for actually reforming the country. Roosevelt campaigned like crazy, traveling around 10,000 miles and visiting 34 states. While he was in Milwaukee, an unemployed saloon keeper named John Schrank shot him right before he was about to give a speech. As it turns out, the bullet did not penetrate his chest. Reportedly, both his steel eyeglass case and his 50-page folded copy of the speech in his pocket maybe saved his life. Anyway, rather than, I don't know, go to the hospital, Roosevelt decided to give the speech anyway. He began his speech saying, quote, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot." Unquote. He went on to finish that 90-minute speech like a bull moose indeed. This election marked the first time New Mexico and Arizona participated in a presidential election, as they both became states earlier that year. As Election Day drew near, things were not looking so good for Taft. To make matters worse, less than a week before the election, Vice President Sherman died. Sherman is the last vice president to have died while in office. And here are the results. Woodrow Wilson won, becoming the 28th president in American history. Even though he had less votes than William Jennings Bryan ever had, he still easily won. He received 435 electoral votes and 41.8% of the popular vote. Coming in second was Teddy Roosevelt, who received 88 electoral votes and 27.4% of the popular vote. This was the last presidential election in which a candidate who was not a Republican or Democrat came in second place in either the Electoral College or popular vote. In third place, William Howard Taft, with just 8 electoral votes and 23.2% of the popular vote. With so many former Republicans joining the Progressive Party, this resulted in the Republicans suffering their worst presidential defeat in history. Taft suffered the worst ever defeat of any president trying to get reelected. Interestingly, both Taft and Roosevelt lost their home states. In fourth place, Eugene Debs got 6% of the popular vote. In fifth, Eugene Chafin got 1.4% of the popular vote. Thomas Marshall became the 28th vice president in American history. Wilson would become the only Democrat president between 1896 and 1932, and only the second of 2 Democrats elected president between 1860 and 1932. Obviously, the Republican split had benefited him greatly, as he won several states that historically had voted for the Republican candidate. This election marked the only time since 1860 in which 4 different candidates each got more than 5% of the popular vote. Also, it was the only election in which a third-party candidate did better than one of the major parties. Again, now look at this map. What the heck? I'll see you for the next election, buddy.
And it was messed up. You can see that Taft and Roosevelt are going to fight each other, and what they do is they set it up for the the Democratic Party. Okay, Woodrow Wilson becomes president of the United States. He is a Democrat. He was a Southerner. He was a history professor and a great speaker. World War I is going to come up. We're going to talk about that later. And he is going to be the second president to get a Nobel Peace Prize with the 14 points. He does have a stroke at the end of his term, and sadly, he is a racist who supported segregation in D.C. So what happens under him? He did build up small business in the middle class, and he has a domestic policy called New Freedom. And this is basically geared towards creating a good, strong middle class. He also went after. So these are 3 of his most important legislative acts: the Federal Reserve Act, created central banks; the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthens the fight against monopolies, Sherman Antitrust; and the Federal Trade Commission. And this basically protects consumers from false claims about weight loss gains, what a drug can do, that sort of thing. Also, now it used to be let the buyer beware. Now buyers had some. He said he was attacking the triple wall of privilege: banks, lowering tariffs, and attacking the trusts. So banks, tariffs, and trusts.
Wilson set to work with much success. He convinced the Senate to pass the Underwood-Simmons tariff, which for the first time since the Civil War reduced tariff rates. Next, he pursued financial reform by establishing a private banking system under federal control to make credit more available throughout the country and quickly adjust the amount of money in circulation. The Federal Reserve System was one of Wilson's greatest achievements and is the cornerstone of our economy even today. The next year, Wilson helped establish the Federal Trade Commission and signed into law the Clayton Antitrust Act. Both the commission and the act were aimed at stopping unfair business practices.
All right, so he is going to be the president. He's racist, but he is appoints Louis Brandeis, the first Jewish person, to the Supreme Court. So he has some kind of goofy, non-racist tendencies. He is going to show a movie called The Birth of a Nation in the White House, and this is a racist movie. It glorifies the Ku Klux Klan, and he says it's like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is it is all terribly true. This is a scene